When we hear stories of people exposed to extreme circumstances, we often wonder how we would react if we found ourselves in a similar situation. How would we respond to having lost everything, like the people in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina? Would we look at the bright side in our attempt to rebuild, as residents of New Orleans have? Or would we sink into a depression, overwhelmed and feeling powerless? There's no doubt that our personality does influence our ability to withstand stress. But psychological research suggests that there are many situational variables that impact our ability to cope with negative life events. One of the most well-established findings in the study of stress and health is the condition of learned helplessness. A condition suffered by people or animals who have learned to believe that negative events in their lives are unchangeable. The perception of futility leads to a state of passive helplessness, even when the person or animal actually has the power to change negative circumstances.
A classic psychological experiment can help illustrate the state of learned helplessness. In 1971, Phil Zimbardo and colleagues conducted what is now known infamously as the Stanford Prison Experiment. Undergraduates at the college took on the role of prison guard or prisoner in this experiment. They lived in a mock prison in the basement of the Stanford Psychology building for what was supposed to be 2 weeks, but only ended up being 6 days. What happened was both groups internalized their roles of prisoner and prison guard. Many of the prisoners became helpless in the face of such abuse. They were able to leave this experiment at any time. None of them chose to do so. Some of them even expected parole and were denied, and they still stayed in this mock prison. It took an outside observer who was visiting for 1 day to stop this experiment. So what were the conditions here that led to this sort of learned helplessness?
This program explores the topic of learned helplessness using historical background, detailing classic psychological experiments, and an alternative interpretation of the phenomenon. Let's look more closely at the factors that influence our response to traumatic events by first examining the history of research into learned helplessness.
Martin Seligman, a longtime member of the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania, is the person most prominently associated with the research on learned helplessness. In the beginning, he and colleague Stephen Meyer were interested in fear conditioning in unavoidable situations. Their research focused on dogs in the classical Pavlovian conditioning paradigm.
Failure to escape traumatic shock.
In this experiment, 3 groups of dogs were tested in 2 phases. In the first phase, 2 dogs were yoked together. One of these 2 dogs was able to press a lever with his foot to control an electric shock. The other dog was not. In the third group, both dogs were not shocked. In the second phase, all dogs were tested on their ability to escape an avoidable electric shock. What the researchers found was that dogs who were yoked in the first phase of the experiment but not able to control the shock were not able to learn to escape the shock in the second phase. Seligman and Meyer believed it was the lack of control which impacted the ability to learn. For the dogs who learned to be helpless, the lack of control in the first situation transferred itself to the second situation where it was no longer true.
As a result of the finding and other follow-up studies, Seligman and colleagues theorized that subjects develop a state of learned helplessness that is demonstrated in 2 ways. 1. Motivation to attempt changes to the situation is lost and results in a decline in performance and an increased level of general passivity. 2. A general expectation that negative events will continue to occur independent of any behavior performed.
A big question over the years is whether or not learned helplessness occurs in situations outside of classical conditioning. Numerous experiments have shown that control is the biggest predictor of learned helplessness in a classical conditioning situation. In fact, a really disturbing experiment conducted by Ramy and Finkelstein in the 70s demonstrated this with babies.
Learning to control the environment in infancy.
Babies pressed a panel to control or not control, as the case may be, the movement of a mobile, the playback of a movie on a projection screen, and the presentation of colored lights. Babies whose behavior did not control the presentations of these three stimuli in the first trial stopped trying to control their environment in subsequent testing. Sadly, these babies learned that their behavior lacked agency.
Negative events in real life seldom operate in the patterns of tightly controlled cause and effect of most experimental classical conditioning paradigms. Even with such conditioning exposure, not all of the dogs in Seligman's original studies learn to be helpless. Furthermore, humans have a greater ability to predict outcomes and learn from the behavior of others than do dogs, rats, or other animals. So is humans' process of learning to be helpless more complicated than simply perceiving a lack of control? Seligman and colleagues soon reformulated their model of learned helplessness in humans to include the impact of attributional style. There are three components of interpreting the meaning of negative events that we can look at using the examples of two students, Gerard and Geraldine, in a calculus class who receive a poor grade. Gerard has been worried that he isn't smart enough for college, and now he's certain he's been right all along. Gerard experiences the effects of learned helplessness, depression, lowered effort, and poor learning. These symptoms of learned helplessness lead to poor performance. Geraldine thinks the professor purposely made a difficult test, but she also admits to herself that she could have studied more. Geraldine studies even harder this time. Without the influence of learned helplessness, her performance improves. Stable, unstable attribution. Gerard makes a stable personality attribution for his failing math grade. He thinks to himself that his poor result means he has a low IQ. Geraldine, on the other hand, is unstable in a good way. She explains her grade in terms of her behavior and decides that she just didn't study hard enough this time. Internal, external attribution. Gerard explains his grade with an internal cause. I am not a math person. Geraldine attributes the results to external factors, for example, the difficulty of the exam. Specific, unspecific attribution. Gerard decides that the failing grade has unspecific general implications, and he must be a stupid person in general. Even if Geraldine decides calculus is not for her, this result is specific and does not mean anything for how good a student she is in psychology or English.
Creating an explanation of a negative event that is stable, internal, and pervasive leads to a state of learned helplessness. On the other hand, creating an attribution that is unstable, external, and specific is a healthy state of coping.
Noise pollution is one such urban fact of life that we have no control over. Studies have shown that loud noise levels impact the learning abilities of children who live near busy highways and airports. The ability to control noise eliminates its impact on performance. David Glass and Jerome Singer looked at the behavioral consequences of controllable and uncontrollable noise while working at the Russell Sage Foundation in 1971. In the experiment, participants heard loud noises comparable to standing on a runway while a jet took off, while solving complex problems. The noises occurred for varying lengths of time and at unpredictable intervals. Some of the participants believed they could press a button to stop the noise, and some had no control over the noise. Some heard no noise. Although no one actually pressed the button to stop the noise, those who thought that they could did just as well on the task as those who heard no noise. Those who had no perceived control over the noise made many more errors on the task.
Actually, the research on learned helplessness in academia also demonstrates the reverse. Learning that life events can be temporary can help us to overcome learned helplessness. And in fact, more long-standing, pervasive patterns of feeling out of control can also be overcome. The notion that people and animals, for that matter, can lose hope and become helpless to change their circumstances can be a profoundly depressing notion to contemplate. But research has shown that small changes can have big effects in people's lives as long as they are handled correctly. Given the choice, most of us would prefer to avoid spending our last years in the nursing home environment. Many of them are bleak places with elderly residents who have little control over being there in the first place, nor the day-to-day aspects of how they live their lives. Someone else tells them what they will eat, what events they will participate in, what medications they need to take. Two researchers, Ellen Langer and Judith Rodin at Harvard, decided to manipulate perceived control in nursing home residents and measure the impact.
Effects of choice and enhanced personal responsibility.
Langer and Rodin theorized that a decision-free environment resulted in a depressed population of nursing home residents. So what they did was a simple manipulation. They had some residents take control of the care of a plant. The other group did not have control over their plant. The staff member took care of it. This simple care of a plant resulted in more alert residents and longer life.
A follow-up study by the same researchers showed even more dramatic results. In the next year, Langer and Rodin found that the experimental group who cared for the plant also lived longer than the control group for whose plants the staff had responsibility. In that year, 15% of the experimental group had died, compared to 30% of the control group. However, it is crucial that the changes in perceived control be made permanent. Giving control to a formerly powerless person, then removing it, can be worse than if he or she never had been given control at all. Richard Schultz at the University of North Carolina was inspired to perform a similar intervention with the elderly. In his study, undergraduates visited nursing home residents once a week for 2 months. For half of the elderly, they themselves controlled when these visits would occur. For the other half, the undergraduate visitor determined the schedule. The control over this small aspect of their lives again had dramatic positive immediate effects on the well-being of the residents. However, when Schultz went back to measure long-term effects months after the visits had ended, he found that he caused harm to the elderly who had been given control and then had it taken away. They had poorer health outcomes and higher mortality rates than those who didn't have control over the timing of the visits. Alternative explanations. Seligman later became interested in the flip side of learned helplessness, learned optimism. As we've explored, explanatory attributions can lead to learned helplessness. Seligman believes that changing habitual attributions can change a pessimistic style to an optimistic one. We can learn to be optimists, or more likely in Seligman's view, we can recapture the original optimism we possessed as children.
There is some more contemporary research which suggests that it's not the lack of control per se which leads to learned helplessness, but more the feeling of unpredictability. Unpredictability can contribute to a sense of learned helplessness in people. Feeling out of control over the events of our lives, feeling that bad things happen to us because we're bad people, or that once bad things start happening, they will continue to happen over and over, can lead to a sense of depression and helplessness, as we've seen. As a society, we need to help people take control over the negative events of their lives. In this way, we can help people to help themselves.